Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. It's really great to have you with us again. We're here to, take some source material, dig in, and pull out those crucial insights. Basically, we do the heavy reading so you get the good stuff, maybe a few laughs along the way. Today, we are tackling something pretty interesting, actually. Our main source is this article by Jorge Pires, Ph.D. It's titled, "Is John Lennox a Classical Case of the Dr. Fox Effect?" So, our mission today, really following this article's lead, is to understand its argument. It's about how sometimes someone's charisma, their confidence, their whole presentation style, well, it might just overshadow the actual substance of what they're saying. The article uses a specific example to explore this, which we'll definitely get into, but the idea itself has much wider implications. We're here to unpack the source's claims for you. See what this Dr. Fox effect is all about according to the article. So yeah, let's start right there. The source kicks off with this core concept. The Dr. Fox effect. What exactly is that, according to the article?
Right. So the source defines the Dr. Fox effect. It's this phenomenon where you have a speaker who's really charismatic, engaging, confident, and because of that style, the audience perceives them as being super intelligent, really insightful, even if, and this is the key part, even if the actual content is, well, vague, maybe misleading, or sometimes even just nonsensical. Basically, style winning out over substance in how people see it.
Huh. That sounds, well, it sounds kind of familiar, maybe?
Yeah.
Does the source say where this term actually originated? Is there a story behind it?
There is, yeah. The article traces it back to a pretty famous experiment from the 1970s. It was quite clever, really. They got an actor, gave him the alias Dr. Myron Fox, and had him deliver this lecture. But here's the twist. The lecture itself was intentionally filled with, meaningless jargon, contradictions, just empty phrases, all delivered, though, with complete confidence and charisma. He really knew his stuff.
Okay, an actor delivering nonsense with confidence. So what happened? Did people buy it?
That's the striking part, according to the source. Despite the absolute lack of substance, Dr. Fox got these, glowing evaluations from the audience. Professionals, educators, they thought he was brilliant, said they learned a lot. It really showed how easily our judgment, our perception of intelligence can be swayed just by the performance.
Wow. That's actually wild. So you can feel like you learned something profound without actually learning anything substantive at all.
Precisely. That's the effect the source is talking about. And it argues this isn't just some old lab experiment. The article that applies this idea directly to Professor John Lennox. Maybe describe who Lennox is based on the source's description.
Sure. So the source paints him as a pretty prominent figure, professor of mathematics at Oxford, but also well-known Christian apologist, famous for debates, especially with atheists like Richard Dawkins. And the article notes his style, speaks with, real gravitas, has this Irish charm, very polished, rhetorically calm demeanor.
Yeah, so someone who definitely projects authority and charisma. Right, all those qualities the source connects to this effect.
Exactly. Seems to fit the bill of a speaker who'd naturally command attention. And this is where the source really makes this move. It asks the core question, doesn't it? It asks, okay, given Lennox's style, does his actual argumentation hold up under close scrutiny? Or is his appeal, according to this source, maybe an example of this Dr. Fox effect in action?
Right, that's the central investigation. The source digs into specific parts of Lennox's arguments to see if there's substance or what the source calls an illusion of depth.
Illusion of depth. Okay, what does the source mean by that? Where does it start looking for this potential illusion?
Well, the source starts with Lennox's historical arguments, specifically his arguments about the literal resurrection of Jesus. The article points out that Lennox often presents this not just as faith, but as established historical fact. And importantly, he frames it as uniquely significant. This event is the basis for Christianity being the only worldview offering real meaning, forgiveness, that sort of thing.
So the source sees him using the resurrection as historical proof for Christianity's unique claims.
That's how the source portrays it, yes. But then, it immediately brings in a counter-argument.
Okay, what's the counter?
The article argues that claims like resurrection, divine conception, miracles, people undergoing profound moral transformations were actually, pretty common in Greco-Roman religious stories around the same time. The source says these kinds of narratives weren't exclusive to early Christianity at all. It even mentions historians like Richard Carrier and Earl Dougherty who've written about these parallels.
Interesting. So the argument is Lennox presents it as unique, but the source says similar stories were actually kind of everywhere back then.
Exactly. The source feels Lennox doesn't really grapple with that broader context. And it gives a really specific example to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah. What's the example?
Pythagoras, the ancient Greek mathematician.
Sure. Triangle guy.
Right. Well, the source points out that ancient traditions and accounts about Pythagoras claim some pretty wild things. Like him appearing in 2 places at once, talking to animals, predicting earthquakes, even chatting with gods.
Wow, okay. Didn't know Pythagoras was supposedly doing all that. How does the source use this?
It uses it as a direct comparison. The source essentially asks, if the kinds of things Lennox points to for Jesus' miracles, divine connections make him uniquely divine, then shouldn't Pythagoras, based on similar kinds of claims from antiquity, also be considered divine, or at least exceptionally significant in the same way?
It's a pointed comparison. What does the source conclude from this?
The source concludes that, in its view, Lennox doesn't really address these kinds of parallels in his public arguments. Instead, the source claims he relies on the rhetorical force of asserting the resurrection's uniqueness, maybe assuming his audience isn't familiar with scholarship that challenges that uniqueness. So the source sees it as presenting a deep-sounding historical case that maybe skips over inconvenient context.
Got it. So that's the illusion of depth. And the historical argument, according to the source, looks solid, but maybe misses the wider picture.
That's the argument, yes. It presents a specific claim, but avoids context that might undermine its uniqueness.
Okay, so history is one area. What else does the source examine? You mentioned something about emotional appeals earlier.
Right, the next section in the article is titled Emotional Sleight of Hand.
Huh.
Here, the source argues that Lennox often frames his defense of Christianity around these really powerful emotional themes.
Like what kind of themes?
Things like justice, the problem of suffering, the search for meaning big human concerns. And the source observes that his critiques of atheism often focus less on evidence and more on these moral or emotional dimensions.
Can you give an example from the source? How does that emotional critique work?
Well, the source quotes Lennox asking a question like, if there's no God who deals with the injustice of this world, which the source sees as a very potent, emotionally charged question.
And what's the source's take on using that kind of question in an argument?
The source argues it kind of sidesteps rigorous intellectual debate. It's seen as an appeal directly to the listener's feelings about injustice. And the source suggests it subtly paints his opponents, atheists in this case, as maybe being indifferent to suffering, just because they don't offer a divine solution.
So it's framed as an emotional point that might put the other side on the defensive, emotionally speaking.
That's the source's interpretation, yes. A rhetorical move using emotion.
Does the source critique the substance of that emotional appeal itself?
It does. It pushes back, asking, does this framing actually solve the problem of suffering? And the source's answer is pretty blunt. Not really.
Okay, why not really? What's the reasoning there?
The source argues that the answer often given in this context isn't about fixing suffering now, it's about postponing the solution to the afterlife. The idea that there's a better world to come, or God will sort it out eventually.
So it provides comfort about future justice rather than a plan for present action.
Exactly. And the source calls this a moral bypass. It suggests this approach shifts the responsibility for dealing with injustice away from human action today and onto, future divine intervention.
Moral bypass. That's another strong phrase from the source.
It is. And the source sums up its view on this kind of appeal pretty sharply. It calls it spiritual comfort food, emotionally satisfying, logically malnourished.
Wow. Emotionally satisfying, logically malnourished. What's the logically malnourished part referring to exactly?
Well, according to the source, it means that while these appeals feel good, they connect with our deep desires for meaning and justice. They don't actually work as logical arguments for God's existence or the truth of Christianity. Wanting justice doesn't logically prove a divine judge exists. The source sees the argument as resting purely on that emotional resonance, not on sound logic or evidence.
So relying on the feeling it creates rather than the logical structure.
That's the source's point, yeah.
Okay. History, emotion. What's the next angle the source takes? Something about science.
Yes. The article then tackles science versus special pleading, looking at how Lennox discusses science and miracles.
Special pleading. Okay, that sounds like another logical fallacy or rhetorical tactic. How does the source apply it here?
Well, the source points out that when Lennox is asked about biblical miracles, water into wine, walking on water, the resurrection, things that seem to violate known scientific laws.
He doesn't just say science is wrong.
According to the source, not usually. He often acknowledges they're scientifically improbable if they were natural events. But then he argues they aren't natural events. They're exceptions, special acts of God intervening outside the normal rules science studies.
And that is what the source calls special pleading. Can you explain that term a bit more?
Sure. Special pleading is basically when you apply different standards to your own beliefs than you apply to others. You demand strict evidence for things you don't believe, but you create a special category, an exception, for your own claims that bypasses those same standards.
So in this case, the source sees it as demand natural explanations follow scientific rules, but miracles get a pass because God did it.
Exactly. The source argues that's applying inconsistent standards. You exempt your own belief from the rules you apply elsewhere. It undermines the consistency, the source argues. And this connects to another point the article raises, unfalsifiability.
Unfalsifiability, meaning you can't prove it wrong.
Right. The source mentions Lennox arguing, for instance, that belief in miracles isn't unscientific because science can't disprove God's intervention. Science can't prove God didn't do it.
Okay, so the logic is science can't disprove it, therefore it's okay to believe it, maybe even scientifically plausible.
That's the logic the source examines, and it pushes back hard. The article argues that being unfalsifiable, impossible to test or prove wrong, isn't a strength of a claim. It's usually seen as a major weakness.
How does the source make that point?
It makes a comparison. If science can't disprove it, make something credible, then, the source says, you'd have to give equal weight to all sorts of untestable claims. The source uses examples like, belief in aliens visiting Earth secretly, or astrology, or Bigfoot. Science can't definitively disprove those things either, in many cases.
So it puts miracles on the same logical footing as Bigfoot, arguing that can't be disproven isn't a good reason to believe something is true or scientific.
That's precisely the source's argument. Unfalsifiability doesn't make a claim strong. It often just means it's outside the realm of science altogether.
Right. It really highlights that not being provably false isn't the same as being provably true, or even likely.
Exactly. It comes back to needing positive substance, not just immunity from disproof.
Okay, so we've covered the source's view on the historical arguments, the emotional appeals, and this science versus special pleading angle. Bringing it all together, what's the source's final verdict on Lennox's approach, viewed through this Dr. Fox effect lens?
Well, the source sums it up pretty directly. It concludes that Lennox's considerable rhetorical skill and confidence often mask what the source considers to be fragile logic underneath. It contends that he presents interpretations based on faith, historical claims the source sees as selective, and these powerful emotional arguments as if they were solid facts or logical proofs.
Does the source give a final sort of takeaway line for that?
It does. It suggests, again, this is the source's phrasing, that many arguments boil down to something like, God must exist because it would be sad if he didn't, and it offers that final image, calling the approach sentimentality wrapped in academic robes, suggesting it looks scholarly on the outside but might lack substance on the inside.
Sentimentality wrapped in academic robes. That's a very striking, critical conclusion from the source. It definitely suggests the presentation is doing a lot of work.
That's the absolute core of the source's argument, yes, the charisma, the style, creating that illusion of depth, while the substance in the source's analysis might be less robust than it first appears.
Wow. Yeah, this is a really detailed look at this source's critique. It certainly gives you a lot to think about regarding how we evaluate arguments.
It really does. And that brings us, I think, to the crucial point, connecting this specific deep dive back to you, listening right now. Why does understanding this article, this Dr. Fox effect concept, matter beyond this one specific example?
Yeah, what's the bigger picture relevance here?
The source's analysis has this broader takeaway that's incredibly relevant today, I think. We are just constantly surrounded by confident, charismatic communicators, right? Politics, media, advertising, even just social media feeds, everywhere.
Absolutely. Slick presentations are everywhere.
And so understanding how arguments are constructed, being able to maybe spot these techniques like appeals relying mainly on emotion or maybe special pleading, and most importantly, learning to evaluate the substance separately from the style. Well, the source implies these are just vital, critical thinking skills for navigating all that information.
Especially when, like the source suggests, a really polished delivery can make almost anything sound convincing at first glance.
Exactly. Being able to pause, look past the shine, and ask, okay, but what's the actual evidence? What's the logic here? That's key to not being easily swayed.
So the source is really urging a kind of active skepticism. Don't just be impressed by the performance. Demand substance.
Right. It argues that developing that discernment between style and substance is crucial.
Well, that certainly was a deep dive into this article's perspective on charisma versus content, using the Dr. Fox effect as its framework. A lot to chew on there.
It definitely leaves you with a question, maybe a challenge, based on the source's points. As you go about your day, as you encounter arguments, maybe watching a debate, reading news, scrolling online, even just chatting with people, think about this. How much might the speaker's confidence or charm be influencing how you receive their message? Can you actively try to separate that style from the actual substance, like this source suggests we should? How do you look beneath the polish?